For Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. I got a couple of areas I want to explore this afternoon. One dealing with the loss of wildlife and biodiversity associated with forestry, but the first one I'll talk about is sort of blends in with what our discussion has been with respect to hydrology and fires and whatnot. And it's my preamble might be a little bit long here just to try and set the stage where I'm coming from. Probably more. Yes, no, I understand that. So, yeah, I'll make sure that I'm within my allotted time limit.
Just that's not supposed to happen,
Chair.
So you know, that's okay. I forgive you. Go ahead, man.
So basically, you know, I go back and when the Premier back in 2014 appointed me Parliamentary Secretary to Forest to look at biodiversity and wildlife habitat in the province. Of course, it was right up my alley. I had an intense interest in that. But after a couple of years, I also started looking at the hydrological impacts to the watersheds in British Columbia. And the one that caught my attention first was the Chilako River within my riding, and a number of farmers coming to me concerned over the spring freshets washing property away and destroying private bridges. And when I looked into that, I became aware of the provincial equivalent clear-cut area policies. It's Extension Note 118 that was put out. And it states that the community watersheds, there can be an equivalent clear-cut area of 20%, fishery-sensitive watersheds 25%, and other watersheds 30%. And so I took note of that, and I found a report done by a private consultant in the early 2000s that indicated that I think it was by 2013, the Chilako River watershed had an ECA of about 80%. And so I looked into that, and I was dealing with the licensee at the time, Canfor, and the complaints from citizens, and I was trying to arrange a meeting. So I confronted Canfor with this information, and I said, here's what I have, is this ECA for the Chilako watershed is at 80%. It's a fishery-sensitive watershed. The Chinook population had been counted in the thousands prior to 2000, and after that it had dwindled until we had single-digit numbers in the salmon counts. So to me, that it's a fishery-sensitive watershed as well. Canfor came back and they said, yeah, we agree, we've done our own calculations on that. And we agree with that number, it's 80%. So we had a meeting and we discussed, there was a couple of areas that they were going to be cutting that had already been approved by Forestry and government. And they did indeed cut those particular areas, which increased the ECA for that area. But I started looking at other areas. I looked at the Parsnip River, I looked at the Anzac River, the Table River, a lot of the watersheds within my riding, and they didn't conform with the instructions that were written in the Extension Note 118. And I perused them all, looked at them all, and then I came across a Forest Practices Board report from 2016 that highlighted some research that had been done that indicated that the loss of the forest canopy was contributing to the frequency and magnitude of floods in the province. And it also said in that particular report that, and I'm paraphrasing here going from memory, that it took, and this study was done, there was a series of studies done in the southern interior, but it took 80 years for a conifer tree to grow to a sufficient height where it started providing the same level of protection from the sun's radiation that the original forest may have had. And if that was 80 years in the southern interior, I thought, my goodness, it's got to be 100 years or more in the central interior and the higher elevations that we see up in my particular riding. But I went into those studies that were highlighted in this 2016 report, and there was a series of them that had taken place into the early 2000s, and a number of them since that were verifying this information. Until a report came out in 2022, I believe, that basically confirmed that the loss of forest cover was indeed connected to the frequency and magnitude of flooding in the province. And it was followed up by a recent science report that came out in December of 2023. Eunice Alila and I forgot the other gentleman, researcher that was involved in that one, both UBC, Eunice Alila is a UBC professor of hydrology. And he conclusively stated that the loss of the forest canopy is the cause of the increased frequency and of floods and magnitude of the floods in the province. So this struck my attention because here we see loss of life associated to flooding in the province. We see billions of dollars of infrastructure damage resulting in the province, in the interior, around the Merritt area, the Nicola Valley, in the Lower Mainland, in the Quesnel area. We just had $1 billion given to the province through the financial disaster assistance to pay for roads, the secondary road infrastructure that was damaged from mudslides and whatnot associated to the loss of forest cover. So my question to the minister is, how has the ministry, what has the ministry done with that information? It's 20-year-old research that has finally culminated in that final report from December 2023, which to me is, you know, as a former superintendent in the RCMP, I had to pay attention to the case law that dictated how we did our investigations, how we handle our evidence, and all those other things in order to comply. And that's what I see this science doing. There's about a dozen or more studies that we should be adjusting how we approach forestry as a result of that. But I also had concerns that when I looked at the clear cutting in British Columbia that we've done since the 1960s, you know, that's not that long ago. So none of the forests that we see in British Columbia have recovered to the point where they can start providing the same level of protection from the sun's radiation that this science says is required, these 80-year trees. We're cutting trees, you know, a lot of secondary forests are being cut right now, but none of these forests have recovered. So I think the clear and present danger facing British Columbia is the risk of floods. And this paper that says that the loss of canopy is causing these floods. And then subsequent to that, with the loss of the canopy, the spring freshets flowing and flushing all the moisture out of the ground. And over the summer months, these watersheds are drying out because there's no forest cover for them. Then we see a heightened risk of wildfire as a result of that. And compounding that, we have the forest plantations, the silviculture practices over the last number of years, now decades, where we're planting monoculture conifer plantations at 1,500 to 3,000 stems per hectare, and more when you see a lot of the natural regen coming into those growths as well, that it's a volatile situation. So I'm curious as to what the ministry is doing about this, whether there's been instruction to the chief forester to include this science into their calculations for the AACs, and whether the AACs are going to be significantly impacted by this on an urgent basis because of the dangers that these floods and fires present to British Columbians.
Minister.
Thank you, Chair. I want to begin by thanking the member for an interesting and challenging question. What he refers to as the ECA is the acronym for Equivalent Clear-Cut Area, and the 80% is indeed the target in the normal times. But what, and I think he knows this well, is that within the Prince George region, the pine forests of the Prince George region, they've been subject to the pine beetle and the spruce beetle, but particularly pine beetle, within the harvesting base as of the fall of 2017. So there's 731 million cubic meters have suffered red and gray attack. It's about 54% of the total pine volume on the timber harvesting land base. So then there's a further estimate of 735 million cubic meters of pine volume on the timber harvesting base will be killed. So that has led to decisions to go beyond the 80% ECA, given the need to harvest and extirpate the beetle and begin a replanting process that removes those very damaged stands. So the follow-on consequence of that is a robust plan of silviculture, and so the provincial silviculture program has planted an average of 278 million trees annually over the last 10 years. In 3 occasions since 2017 fires, there's been over 300 million trees planted. So the idea is, and the way to revive and meet the concerns about the hydrology is to replant and to regrow the forest in a way that would address those hydrological issues. As the member knows, that's not done overnight, but that's the direction that is being taken. The province has partnerships with the federal government, 2 Billion Trees program, Clean BC through the Forest Investment Program, and also the province has funded silviculture research through a new institute in Smithers that's going to look at the best ways to engage in silviculture. The chief forester does take account, here I've just got a quick note here, does incorporate the best forest science into the decisions that he makes. So the way to deal with the hydrological issues that the member mentions is by prompt and extensive and intensive to replanting in the dimensions and the numbers that are being done.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. And to the Minister, a little alarmed by his answer. That 80% is the target, and it's even higher for ECAs through the central interior and the pine-dominated areas, perhaps. I go back, and I've been aware and involved in these kinds of things now for quite some time. And I recall when the pine beetle was at its height in the Prince George Timber Supply area and throughout the province, that the Prince George district manager put a soft partition in place saying, forest companies, concentrate on the pine. And the entire Prince George Timber Supply area will have a, up to a maximum of 800,000 cubic meters can be greenwood, and the rest has to be the dead pine. But that was for all the operators in the area. And what happened is each of the licensees took 800,000 cubic meters of wood. And instead of the, there was a lot of dead pine that was taken, but there was a lot of the midterm timber supply that was taken as well. And I brought this up in a presentation I made to the Council of Forest Industries in 2015. Said, you guys are cutting down your midterm timber supply, and we will be out of harvestable wood within the next 8 to 10 years if this rate carries on the way we have. And I understand, the method. The foresters at the time thought eliminating all the dead pine, and I've heard the forest companies use the term sanitizing the forests from these terrible bugs that are there. That's a misconception for the public. I think they get the wrong idea from that. Pests are a natural reality in our forests, and they have been since time began. But it was devastating on the pine beetle. And if 80% ECA is the norm, I shudder to think about the consequences when I look at the 20 years of research from the University of BC Hydrology Department. But most of my area is predominantly spruce and balsam. And a lot of that spruce and balsam, there was some mixed pine in the areas as well. The spruce beetle came along and has destroyed a lot of the spruce forest that is throughout the Omanika. But, you know, the spruce doesn't last as long, so we don't see that vim and vigor going in there and cutting it down to the extent that we saw the pine trees, because the pine will last 20 years. In fact, there's dead pine standing today that is still a quality saw log. The spruce doesn't last that long. But I'm concerned, you know, that we see forestry taking advantage of the pine beetle as a reason to cut everything down, to sanitize our forest. In actual term, it's a better term would be to sterilize our forests as a result of that. And this will lead into my next round of questioning, but the question I pose to the minister now is, how did we let it get to this 80% ECA over these vast thousands and thousands of hectares of clear cut in the last 20 years, when science, this science that I talked about earlier, has been, you know, presented these issues as a clear and present concern 20 years ago. And they have been building on those initial outcomes from those researchers taking place throughout the province, to the point where they conclusively say now today that that has caused the floods. We're downhill. I live, you know, half of my riding is in the Arctic watershed, the other half is in the Pacific watershed. And when everything goes array and these clear cuts that are now happening in the upper reaches of the Fraser Basin and the upper reaches of all the watersheds in BC flood, it goes downstream. And the people in Abbotsford will see the results of that taking place. When we see the Coldwater River, which has been severely over-harvested as well, doing the same thing. And I think Merritt sees the result of that. Is the minister not concerned of some liability being exposed to the province, or the province being exposed to this liability, because we are still continuing, now that we know the cause, we are still continuing to harvest at the same rate, and we are diminishing the overall canopy that we have, and it's going to add to the situation that we see with floods and fires in the future.
Minister?
Thank you, Member. A couple of points that emerged during our discussions here in an effort to answer the member's question. The ECA of 80% was elevated during the time of the pine beetle and the spruce beetle. What the normal target is, and the target now, is 20 to 30% ECA. So I think I may have left a misleading impression with the member in my earlier answer. The other point that I would make would be that given that the impact of the pine and the spruce beetle and killing those trees, even if there was no harvest, they would still have the same hydrological impact, because dead trees do not absorb water. So the effort and the policy back in post 2015 in that region that the member mentioned was to stop the beetle and capture the value and create the jobs that came from that. So that was the ethic at that time. But the AAC has come down, the annual allowable cut set by the Chief Forester has come down dramatically as a result of the pine beetle, as a result of the fires. And in fact, last season, the 2.3 million hectares burned far exceeds the area that's been harvested in the entire province. There's about 95 million hectares in the entire province, and 2.3 million hectares was the subject and burned to some degree or another last summer. So and that has the same potential hydrological impacts that the member referred to. So the challenge is, and the AAC, just given all those factors and the best science that is being applied by the Chief Forester, is at least 40% lower than it was beginning. It's come down over the period 2011 to 2021, 40%, and it will continue to decline. Indeed, that's the subject of some concern by the industry about the harvestable area. It is declining. I think what is looked for in the economic side is some stability and predictability as to where harvesting opportunities will continue to exist. But some of the concerns that the member raised, and I'm not dismissing them in any way, are mitigated by the fact that the future in terms of the harvesting areas is much reduced from what it was during the height of the logging that was dealing with the consequences of the beetle infestation.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. I appreciate the Minister's answer, and it's a good segue into the second part of my question. But I just want to comment here, when he talks about the equivalent clear-cut area being extended to 80% because of the pine beetle and spruce beetle that we see, and has dropped now down to 20-30% on average across the province. And the fact that the pine beetle did have implications on the hydrology of the land, it did for sure. I can attest to that. You know, operating my trap line during that period of time, the ground never dried out. It was standing water in the ground, and the pine trees were dead. But the mixed spruce that was in the area as well would loosen up because they're shallow roots, and the wind would blow them down, and that of course attracts the spruce beetle and with these down trees. So it was a significant problem. But it was exacerbated by the clear-cut strategy, in my humble opinion. And I think others share that as well. When we see vast areas of clear-cuts, and there's one in my riding right now that is over 3,000 hectares in size, that was harvested in the Carey Lake area, we see vast areas that have been clear-cut of everything, not just the dead pine or the dead spruce, but the balsam, the birch, the poplar, all the deciduous growth that is in there as well. And that is having further impacts on not only the hydrology on the land, but the biodiversity that's on the land base as well. There's 81 species of wildlife that den or nest in tree cavities in British Columbia. And when we eliminate all of those tree cavities, we eliminate those species from that area. And we've seen regional extirpation of a lot of these species as a result of this. So between the clear-cutting impacts on hydrology, the clear-cutting has had significant impacts on the wildlife populations in the province. Looking at the statistical data over the last 40, 50 years, you know, I look at moose for an example, their populations have dropped significantly in the Dominica. When I look at raptors like goshawks, I don't see goshawks anymore in the Dominica region, and they used to be prolific. They were there all the time. Great horned owls, the great gray owls, and I don't see any of those animals in the forest, in the Dominica region. I went so far as to driving around the Prince George Timber Supply, the Quesnel Timber Supply area, Lakes District Supply area, purposefully looking for stick nests that these goshawks and these owls would inhabit. And I couldn't find any. And under Section 34 of the Wildlife Act, it's illegal to cut down a stick nest at any time, period. And there was a requirement for, and I walked into I put 15,000 kilometers on my truck driving into these areas. I used binoculars. I walked in and looked at areas that I couldn't get a good look at, and I couldn't find a one. And I found that astounding, being the fact that a lot of these areas had large populations of goshawk and owls and other raptors in the area, let alone fur bears. The marten population, I find a report from 1986 that was done by Fish and Wildlife Branch on marten densities in British Columbia, and a fairly lengthy report. The bibliography attached to that report is 10 pages long. And I picked maybe a dozen or 15 studies that the bibliography referred to, and every single one of them talked about the impacts that harvesting and clear cuts had on marten populations. The Dominica region had some of the densest marten populations in all of British Columbia. They're basically gone. I hardly see a marten anywhere, and they were prolific at one particular time. Same with the fisher. So there's been all kinds of indicators that government should have been monitoring and looking at over the last 50 years that indicate the impacts of clear cutting on wildlife populations. And when we see this 50% decline in wildlife populations in the last 50 years, in some cases we see regional extirpation, so 100% of the species is gone from some of these areas, that's a concern for me. So recently it was brought to my attention, there was a goshawk study being done in the Morris River area out of Houston that indicated that, so it was a study that was conducted by a professional wildlife biologist, a forester, and another expert in the field. And it was funded by Canfor. They graciously funded this particular study. But it indicated that goshawks need about 44,500 hectares of primary forest to support one goshawk colony. And a goshawk colony is the male, female, and the nestlings from that particular year. The study indicated that there's only 35 colonies left in the entire area out of approximately 450. And that's a concern for me. So it's my understanding that a copy of this report was forwarded to the chief forester and to the regional executive director for that particular region up there for their comment and advice. And these researchers provided some advice on how we move forward from this. The comment that I understand came back from one of those offices was it's got too big of an economic impact on our forest operations, therefore we're not going to consider it. I find that fascinating, that we would not consider the fact that we would go all out and extirpate wildlife populations from British Columbia in favor of a tree that will take 200 or 300 years to grow back to the point where it will provide the same kind of habitat. So the question to the minister is, when we look at the hydrological science that has come out from UBC, when we look at all of the data and all the warning signals from the wildlife biologists on fur bearers, on raptors, on ungulates, on salmon, on other species that we have here, saying that the loss of forest cover is contributing to the degradation of this habitat and is impacting these populations. So what is the ministry doing about that today? And how are we going to move forward so that we start reestablishing the biodiversity and the habitat necessary to support robust populations of all these species of wildlife that we have in the province, and at the same time trying to restore the hydrological integrity of the watersheds that we have in British Columbia to keep British Columbians safe?
Members, we'll take a brief recess. And before we do, I should just like to clarify the controversial comments made by the member for Peace River South regarding my attire. And I'd just like to quote from the report of the acting clerk to the Speaker of the Legislative Assembly, Dress Guidelines and Expectations of the Parliament Buildings 2019, paragraph 6. Men may wear contemporary business attire and neckties are not required. So for the edification of those watching, and indeed for those members present, the dress code clarification has occurred, and we will recess until 5 after the hour. Thank you. Members, we'll call the Committee of Supply Section A back to order. We're currently considering the estimates of the Ministry of Forests. And I believe the Minister has a response to the previous question. Minister, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for that clarification on the dress code. I appreciate that, although I'm not going to follow your lead. So the question of the member is essentially, given what he's spoken about, what are we doing to change forest management and forest practices? So I think I would start with the Old Growth Strategic Review, which has produced 14 recommendations, commissioned and written by Al Gorley and Gary Merkel. And we've adopted all 14 of those recommendations. So there are a number of specific recommendations in there that address some of the concerns that are raised. But before I do that, I just want to talk a little bit about the conservation fund that was established, the $300 million in First Nations-led Conservation Fund in partnership with BC Parks was announced by the Premier and by Minister Wilkinson federally not so long ago. And there's a promise of more private sector philanthropic money to expand that money for conservation areas. So one of the directors of, I think it's Ken Wu, the executive director of the Endangered Ecosystems Alliance, said, the Premier has delivered. This is a huge conservation victory for many thousands of people who've spoken up for this for years. One of the other steps in the Old Growth Strategic Review, recommendation number 6, was the deferral process, and that has largely been worked through the system, but those are steps to conserve forests, in particular the oldest and rarest ones. Another innovation, and there's money in the budget previously, and there's further money in the budget this year, is putting communities together through new forest landscape planning tables, which will address the very values that the member spoke of: wildlife values, biodiversity, hydrology, river systems, to drive improved forest management and incorporate local knowledge and community priorities. As I've said, we're investing in improving silviculture practices to support alternatives to clear cutting. We're updating laws and regulations to embed ecosystem health in forest decisions. And so balance that on the other side with a new BC Manufacturing Jobs Fund to support more sustainable jobs, invest in ongoing manufacturing operations where the infusion of fresh capital for new equipment will assist there. We've also developed the value-added category, which will provide a certain percentage of, beginning at 10%, of BC timber sales to a separate category of smaller producers who are qualify for as value-added producers, that they will be able to bid on the auctions, and them only on those auctions, and have timber for their ongoing operations. That's the intention is, and the ambition is to expand that program, but it's certainly up and running, very well received by the value-added sector. So what we are striving for in the change that we brought about is a different approach to forest management. And in the era of wildfires and the pine beetle, there are certainly, it's required. And I think our public demands a change in forest management. And I think some of the views that the member has expressed are views that are shared not by the whole population, not by everyone in resource communities. Certainly I acknowledge that, and I spoke to forest workers and their representatives just yesterday. So there's certainly a diversity of opinion on this issue, but within the Old Growth Strategic Review, there is room for conservation areas and areas of intense economic harvesting activity. And the challenge, which will be met through the forest landscape planning process, is to bring those views together and make decisions on a regional basis about where harvesting activity will take place and areas that will be conserved. So I hope that provides some comfort to the member.
Member.
Thank you, Chair. It raises more concern. I didn't hear much urgency in there with respect to the hydrological, the impact of the hydrological studies on how we do forestry in British Columbia. But, the minister spoke about the strategic review and the deferrals of old growth, the valuable trees that are so necessary to preserve the biodiversity that we have in the province. And of course, there's some controversy out right now about the boundaries of the deferral area being moved, and now including other forests that, in my experience and observations over the years, the forest companies wouldn't be looking at, other than the fact that we're out of wood today, because it's high elevation, low volume, low value wood that, for the most part, they're not getting very many saw logs out of it, particularly when some of it's impacted by the spruce beetle. But it's high elevation, low volume wood that would have been ignored 20 years ago by industry. I heard the minister today speak in question period in an answer, talking about the saw logs would be separated, and any of the low volume wood that the licensees would take in these deferral areas would be diverted to pellets or to bioenergy or to the pulp sector, depending on the quality of the wood. It's still clear cutting, and I've driven into these clear cuts, and it's still clear cutting in a significant way. But I want to ask the minister, what value does the minister or the ministry place upon biodiversity on the wood that they call low value? They cut it all down. Some of it's probably tree cavities for one of the 81 species that we have. But how do they determine the low value of this wood? Is it based on solely the value to the forest sector, to 2x4s or pulpwood or the pellet industry? Or do they include the value of evapotranspiration, value of habitat for the wildlife that are there? What's wrong with leaving that so-called low-value wood standing where it is, instead of cutting it all down and shipping it all to Scotland or to Europe in the form of pellets when we wipe out the biodiversity that's on the ground? And I'll finish up with this as part of this question. Somebody once asked me, and I put the question out to them as well, what happens to the wildlife that's in an area that is being harvested? And I said, well, they die. The wildlife dies. And they kind of look at me and they say, well, don't they scamper off and run and hide in the surrounding area? And I said, there's 81 species of wildlife that den or nest in these tree cavities, and a lot of them are crushed and killed in the logging exercise by itself. The ones that are lucky enough to escape that kind of an unfortunate demise will either go into an adjacent forest that might be close by if we have any left, but those are all territorial animals, whether it's a fur bear, whether it's a raptor, and there's a fight to the death. And there's no net increase to the wildlife population as a result of that. The ones that are unfortunate enough to wander off into an area that's already been clear cut, there's no habitat, there's no shelter, there's no food, there's nothing for that particular animal, and they perish. So, when we look at that, and we look at establishing a value and say it's low value stuff, we're just going to chip it and haul it away, does the minister take into consideration all of these other factors and values that are on the land?
Minister.
Thank you very much. The member makes a point about value and how is value calculated, and makes a reference to what's described as sometimes as low-value timber. What we did do as part of the change in forest policy is bring about the elimination of the requirement for, in submitting forest stewardship plans to the ministry, to eliminate the requirement that not to, and the language was not to unduly impact timber supply, which was basically, the entire focus was on economic timber values, and that focus has been removed. So one is entitled to consider other values, and in fact, that's, I would say, a requirement. One would be biodiversity and ecosystem management, and that, I think, would address some of the concerns that the member has raised. The third consideration in the era of climate change and wildfire hazard is to consider public safety and the fuel load that any area might represent, and tailor any harvesting plan in that way to take into account public safety. So the range of values has shifted, and it is no longer focused entirely upon timber values.
Member, Prince George Mackenzie.
Thank you, Chair. Appreciate the minister's answer. And my report on getting the balance right that I put out in 2015 as parliamentary secretary did make the recommendations to remove that particular clause. It was an off-ramp that I saw in the regulations that caused me concern on enforcement. It should have been taken out a long time ago. And some of the other recommendations I made in that report, I'm glad to see that the minister has incorporated into some of the changes to the Forest Act. But it's not moving quickly enough. And in my humble opinion, I think the ministry is sending out mixed messages with respect to those changes under the Forest Act. And with respect to some other comments about a robust industry, I'm wondering how we're going to have a robust industry when I look and I see what we have out there for primary forest that's left, and the urgent requirement for us to cease cutting that primary forest because of the loss of biodiversity that we will never get back, and as a source for trying to introduce the extirpated wildlife into some of our regions that has been extirpated as a result of overharvesting. So we're not moving quickly enough, in my humble opinion on this. And I think the urgency is heightened by Professor Alila's scientific studies on hydrology, but the catastrophic loss of wildlife that we see right across the province, and the snail's pace in which government is approaching the old growth deferral area, trying to appease, and I understand that, and I do understand the concern about the folks that are involved in the forest sector and working, but at the end of the day, if there's no raw material to bring in, then what? What do we do? And one of the other, maybe I'm just editorializing now more than questioning, but one of the other, I first went to government back in 2000, early 2000s, concerned about the cumulative impacts of resource development and of forestry. And I went to them several times over this, and I saw the development of the cumulative effects strategy. And I thought, okay, this is a step in the right direction. But here we are just about 20 years later, and we still have this cumulative effects framework that we're using as a process to guide our forest practices principles across the province here. But it hasn't been working. Any person, I'm just a regular guy, and if I can go out and see the impact that it has on biodiversity and wildlife populations and the hydrological impacts that we see on the land base, here we have a group of scientists that have been working on this for decades, and we don't seem to be any further ahead there. So, strong action and affirmative action needs to be taken to protect the remaining biodiversity that we have. Forestry needs to change. It will be forced into changing whether it wants to or not. But we can no longer maintain the status quo of forestry in the province here moving forward. So I said my piece. I know some of it might be controversial to some, but I think we need to have a real hard look at this and make some changes as quickly as we can. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Minister.
Thank you. I want to thank the member for his intervention. I would say that, and I share his sense of urgency. I'm not sure that we totally agree on the direction, but we are making changes. We are making, and he referenced a number of issues that he raised during the time of the previous government, and apparently he wasn't successful in persuading the government that he belonged to and to make those changes. So we are making changes, but you have to bring people with you, and that's what we're endeavoring to do. The Old Growth Strategic Review and its full implications and the way in which we're implementing, I think, is the industry, the forest industry understands that change is in order. And in fact, some parts of it they have accepted and digested, not without some objections and some suggestions for how it might be done differently. But nonetheless, I think we are proceeding forward. But we still have we still want to balance a vibrant and strong forest industry with acknowledgement and incorporation of many of the values that the member expresses, and those are being considered in the new forest management approach that we're taking.